Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Simone Boselli. I'm a Public Affairs Director at EURORDIS. And I would like to welcome you, everyone that has registered for today's webinar, where we're going to talk about our multi-stakeholder symposium taking place on the 13th and 14th of February 2019. As we already done last week, today we are going to talk about two specific sessions, two specific breakout sessions. But before going into the details of today's webinar, just a couple of housekeeping rules. Please mute all your microphones. And if you have any questions, there is a possibility to ask questions to all attendees and participants via the relevant box here on the webinar, and we will do our best to respond to all your questions. Today, I'm joined by Victoria Hedley, Rare Disease Policy Manager from the Newcastle University, whom you will probably all know. Now, in the next 60 minutes, I will just quickly give an overview of what this webinar will touch about, and then we'll go into more details about the third multi-stakeholder symposium, and then it will be followed up by an explanation of the breakout sessions 1 and 4. This will be preceded by an introduction by Victoria, whom I thank very heartfeltly for preparing these slides, explaining what is the context and around the points in breakout session 1 and 4. Ideally, we'll close up with question and answer, but please feel free to ask your question during the webinar. So what we're going to talk about today is really specifically about what is the multi-stakeholder symposium, what we expect to achieve, what are the aims and objectives, and in particular today we'll talk about the context of breakout session 1 and 4, which the purpose of this webinar is to prepare everyone for what the discussion will be during this breakout session and what type of input we would like to receive from you all, in order to have really constructive and collaborative breakout session in order to feed into the outcomes document of the symposium. Now, where are we coming from particularly? As you might remember, we already had two multi-stakeholder symposium in 2006 and 2017, which have highlighted challenges, areas of agreements, and initiated to propose solutions to the deadlock that we are facing as people living with rare diseases. On one hand, speeding up the development of treatment for rare diseases, but at the same time accessing the available ones. Now, as on the back of those two multi-stakeholder symposium, EURORDIS in 2019, in January last year, presented our position on breaking the access deadlock to leave no one behind. And on the basis of the 4 pillars for a structured approach to access in Europe for therapies for people with rare diseases, we are basing these breakout sessions on those pillars at the 3rd multi-stakeholder symposium, where we're proposing a structured approach and recommendation for future actions. This is the title of the 3rd multi-stakeholder symposium, which will take place on the 13th and 14th of February. And it will be over the 2 days. We will have a plenary, an opening plenary and a closing plenary. And in between, we'll have 4 breakout session, 2 in parallel, so breakout session 1 and 2 on the 13th, a breakout session 3 and 4 on the 14th of February. Now, I wanted to give you today a little bit of a glimpse into the final or near final program. As you can see, we have a good representation from authorities, namely from the Ministry of Health in Romania, which is currently holding the rotating presidency of the European Union. Where Tiberius Marius Bradatan will represent Sorina Pintea, Minister of Health of Romania, delivering the opening keynote speech. We'll have a patient testimony from Mencia de Lemus, President of SMA Europe. Then we'll go into the more details about how the manufacturers and regulators look at how the overall framework for life science developments for rare disease therapies could look like in the next few years, followed by a panel discussion outlining the key interest for different constituency in having a sound and appropriate framework that could speed up the access to rare disease therapies. Now, the breakout sessions will start from left to right and back again in a circle with how we could collaboratively define a new blueprint to spend efficiently and fast-track research and development. How multi-stakeholder early dialogues can optimize determination of value. What are the possibilities to create a transparent European commemoration framework in determination of prices and budget impacts? And concluding with a continual approach to evidence generation. Today, we are focusing on breakout session 1 and 4, which are in a way linked as they represent the generation of data in the clinical phase, but also in the post-authorization phase, and how the two can link together in a continuum to provide better data in relation to understanding of the diseases, but also how treatments and care are impacted those diseases, and how we can use those data to make better treatments. Now, that is the backdrop of this program. Now, I would like to introduce Vicky, whom will give us an overview of what's happening at the moment and why it is important to have a comprehensive approach to research and data gathering. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you very much, Simone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, perfect. So welcome everyone. So what I want to do in the next, say, 15 minutes is to just do a bit of scene setting, because I think these two breakout sessions, particularly, as Simone has said, are very much come down to data. And we've heard this from the previous symposia. We talk about how we can make better use of data in rare diseases to support this therapy development pipeline and to get greater accessibility and availability of the therapies that we do have. Data is essential. It can contribute and is necessary at pretty much every phase of the therapy development pipeline. You can even go way back to the preclinical, and you can think about big data approaches to trying to screen for potential new therapies. You can see what would be appropriate for particular biomolecular pathways. But when we come to thinking about clinical trials in any rare disease, you need various types of data, and you need that all the way along this development pipeline. And I think sometimes it's very easy to get confused about what sort of data we're talking about for which purposes. But very simplistically, if you want to do a study, a trial in a rare condition, you need to have a good idea of the natural history of that disease. You need to know pretty well how that condition is going to develop naturally if there were no interventions. That will be necessary for you to try to assess what you can measure over the course of the trial. So what are you going to be recording? What are your endpoints and your outcomes going to be to show that your therapy is having some impact? Increasingly, we're seeing, and indeed we're encouraging, more adaptive routes to market for medicines, and especially in some of these orphan conditions, the evidence base is not as strong through the traditional routes as one would hope. That's not possible with the numbers. So increasingly, we're seeing the importance of collecting post-marketing surveillance data for these conditions. So what I wanted to, and maybe if we go to the next slide, Simone. Okay, and one more click, we'll bring the link at the top. Okay, perfect. So what I wanted to highlight is that, some of you, we've got, I think, 50 plus people on the call. Some of you will have been to all the previous symposia, and you'll have been to many other rare disease data related meetings. Registries particularly come up time and time again around these big topics, and you'll be very, very familiar with what's happening across the rare disease field. Others of you may be more new, or you may be very well versed in what is happening in your particular disease area, but maybe not so aware of what's happening in the bigger picture. And what we thought would be useful is not to give people homework, but for those who feel that they would like to do a little bit of background research before they come to the symposium next month, I wanted to highlight in particular a report where you can find a start, you can find an overview of the different sorts of activities that are going on across Europe, looking at how best to capture and exploit and utilize precious rare disease data. So the report, the link on the screen, is an output that actually I was very involved in writing, so I'm trying to celebrate my own hard work from last summer. Some of you will be aware of this resource. The resource is called The State of the Art of Rare Disease Activities in Europe, and it's really composed of two parts. This part is an overview report. It's intended as a high-level summary of lots of things happening across Europe for rare diseases. And again, it's not disease-specific. It's in theory, initiatives or policies or laws that are applicable to any condition and drive things forward. The other half of the report, which I won't go into today, is more about national data collection and country reports. But I wanted to highlight this report to you because you can see about halfway down there, there is a section specifically on European reference networks. We'll go back to that in a few minutes. There's also two other sections that I would highlight, one on registries and one on research highlights. So what those sections do is they just summarize some of the initiatives out there which are looking at how to make better use of the data we have and how to share data, or at least make it shareable. I'm not going to go through all of these, and I'm not going to go into huge detail, but just to give you a taster, because what's often happens in these meetings is that somebody might suggest, oh, it would be great if we had X, Y, and Z. Well, sometimes we do have X, Y, and Z. It's just that it's not quite at the right stage of deployment, or it's maybe not familiar to people on the ground. So I'm going to try and do a bit of context building. So Simona, slide if you would. Perfect. So registries is a good one to focus on. This is just a graphic which is based on the Orphanet data, and this comes from the report that I just showed you. So we have a huge range of registries across Europe. We have 747 are registered. Registries are registered in Orphanet. The vast majority of these are operating at the national level. Slide, if you will, Simone. And because of this, because of the large number of registries we have, some of them are very disease specific, some of them are really about natural history, others are designed more for trial readiness and recruitment in some of the disease areas where therapies are becoming more available and more popular. Because of this fragmentation, back in 2013, the European Commission invested in a particular initiative. So it's not a time-bound project. It's a piece of work which is being led by what we call the research arm of the European Commission. And that's the JRC, the Joint Research Centre, which is based in Ispra. And the mandate that the Joint Research Centre team had was to create a European platform for rare disease registration. Now, over the years, these plans have been taking shape, but I think in the last year particularly, the overarching, the ambition and the details of what they actually want to create and offer the field is becoming much more clear. Some of this is still very much to be implemented, but the plans are quite concrete. So again, you can find a summary in the report I showed you of what the JRC is doing at the moment, and you can get some of these diagrams. I'll fly through it to give you a highlight of some of the most relevant points, I think, for our discussions next month. So the JRC, the platform in Ispra, on the one hand, is functioning as a bit of a data repository for registry data from two particularly well-established groups of registries, so for cerebral palsy and also the EURORDIS registries. The other half, which is the green interoperability strand, is coming up with tools and resources which in theory are available to any registry in Europe, whether existing or to new registries. So if you click for me, Simone. So this is just a close-up of that green bit around the interoperability. So everything's acronyms in this field, as you know. So the EURORDIS is the European Rare Disease Registry Infrastructure. And this is what the Commission, through the JRC team, is putting together. If you click one more time for me, Simone. Perfect. So they are setting up a European directory of registries, that's the purple box, which is designed to give an overview of the different rare disease registries joining the platform. Now, exactly what it means to join the platform is still not 100% clear, but essentially it means that you're willing to sign up to contribute some data or some data items to this system. So that will be a place to find out what registries for rare diseases are out there, but also to have some more detailed characteristics about what they are and what type of registries they are. There's going to be a central metadata repository. That's important because we know these days that we can't think about pooling all sorts of data from all diseases in one single pot. It just wouldn't work even if you wanted to do that. What you can do is try to harmonize the way in which you capture your metadata, so the data about the data. So you can almost advertise to the world what sorts of data your registry is collecting. So what diseases is it focusing on? Is it collecting particular clinical outcomes, for instance? There will be a pseudonymization tool provided. I'll go back to this in a second. We know that when it comes to facilitating rare disease research, it's often very helpful to know whether the same patient has provided data to various different, often very fragmented resources. So as an example, do you have some sort of genetic data on the patient for diagnostics? Do they also have a biosample somewhere in a European biobank? Do they have a nice clinical detailed phenotypic picture. It's very helpful for researchers sometimes to be able to link these together, again, under the appropriate safeguards. And one way of doing that is to pseudonymize that data. So basically giving it a nonsense string of numbers and letters, which means that you can't tell that the patient is Victoria Hedley, or at least not easily. But as a researcher, you would know it was one and the same patient who'd given those samples and those data items. If we click again. Perfect. So this is that was the Joint Research Centre's Patient Registries Initiative. And as I say, they're really doing a launch of this very soon, but I think it's a good idea to know the sorts of things that they're coming up with. And one of them, which I didn't show details of, is they've actually defined or released a proposed core data set for rare disease registries. This is something we've talked about at lots of previous meetings. So again, do have a look at the report and you can see what those proposed core items are. Another resource which I wanted to highlight, which is very relevant to these discussions, is being led by the European Medicines Agency. And this is their Patient Registries Initiative. The good news is that the previous initiative, which the Commission was running, is now in crosstalk with this one, so that's good. We like it when the different teams within the European Commission are collaborating. What's this all about, and why does it matter for our symposium? Well, this is about trying to facilitate interactions between registry owners, registry coordinators, whether these are academics or patient groups, and the potential users of registry data at an early enough point in the therapy development pipeline. So we are aware that especially in rare diseases, the regulators are often asking companies to set up registries to capture data and to show the benefit risk evaluation of that medicine even after marketing authorization. So registries have huge potential to do this, but what this initiative is looking at is, do existing disease registries in the form that they're operating in Europe, are they actually fit for purpose to do this? Are they going to meet the needs that industry have in terms of quality of the data, the reliability, the completeness? And again, this isn't specifically for rare diseases this time, but there are some very important synergies, and there are some reports which are emerging on how registries in fields like multiple sclerosis, I think haemophilia was a recent one, how they could actually be used for this sort of post-marketing activity. So next slide, please, Simone. Okay, I'll skim through this one very fast. We have, as a result of numerous projects, which I'll show you in a moment, we've got quite a good understanding in 2019 of some of the ways in which we can capture data, code data, describe data, which will enhance the power of that data to do more, to be shared or to be queried or to become, as we say, interoperable. So we know that there are particular systems for coding and for capturing terminologies. So the Orphanet Rare Disease Ontology, very important. Another one that you may have heard about is the Human Phenotype Ontology. Both of these have received a certain level of global endorsement, if you like, as being particularly sensitive and appropriate for capturing certain types of rare disease data. So really our next steps in some cases, having accepted this, is first of all, we have to optimize and improve the content of the ontology for the diseases we're concerned with, and then actually start to use these ontologies in our systems. I've mentioned earlier this concept of a system, a way to somehow pseudonymize data, so protecting patient identity, but allowing data to be shared to drive forward the pace of knowledge and the pace of research. And we've recently, I would say the last 6 months or so, reached a fairly good consensus in Europe of a particular type of way of pseudonymizing data. I'll go back to this if anyone has any particular questions, because it's not an easy thing to summarize in a few seconds. But again, you can find this all in the report that I showed you. If you do these things, if you use ontologies, if you capture data in a way that makes it somehow able to be pseudonymized and shared or queried, these are steps in the process to making your data fair. So FAIR is a set of principles for data management and data stewardship, and it stands for making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. It's not about openly sharing all the data that you collect, that's really important, but it's about capturing it and almost, you know, if you imagine a shop front, It would be advertising in the front of your shop window what kind of products you sell inside. It wouldn't be showing you all the products. It wouldn't let you access the products. That's the way that I describe FAIR in relation to something like a registry. So you would be telling the world, I have a registry. I capture data on patients with X number of conditions, and these are the diagnoses. And this is the sorts of data I'm capturing. If you then wanted to try to access that, you would have to go through the lock and key and through the different levels of security. Next slide, Simone, you please. So there are many actors who are involved. I've mentioned a couple of them, especially around registries, but there are lots of actors involved at the European level and beyond in trying to do something about increasing the power of this precious rare disease data. RD Connect has developed a lot of understanding, I think, about the use of some of these ontologies, like the Orphanet rare disease ontology, the human phenotype ontology, especially for diagnostics. You see down there the Joint Research Centre, I've talked about their platform already. EURORDIS, there's all sorts of important recommendations and guidance, not just around data, but around things like methodologies for trials, biomarkers. They publish many excellent reports. I've talked about the FAIR principles there at the bottom right, and actually some of us have now come together in what we call a GoFair network. And the GoFair network is a bunch of people, mainly quite techie, clever IT people, and then people like me, where we come together and we try to look at what it actually means to make your data fair. So for the registry example I was talking about, how would you do that labeling of your shop window? How would you ensure that you're showing people what information you've captured without actually giving them access directly to the data itself? So this is the GoFair initiative. Corbel on the bottom left. There are a number of infrastructures which have existed across Europe for a number of years, which are designed to support and fast forward research. Now, several of these are potentially very, very relevant to all the discussions that we'll be having next month. And a number of them have come together to try to see, for rare diseases specifically, how can we make better use of some of the data we have to fulfill specific use cases? Because I think often we have these ideas which are up here, but to really show if something's going to work or not, and to show how you can make that data shareable and for what purpose, you need to have proper investment and proper use cases. So that's what they're going for. Last but not least, the European Joint Programme, the EJP, is an acronym that if you haven't heard this already, you will hear it an awful lot over the coming months. The EJP is described in some detail in this big report that I've mentioned. So if you're not familiar with it, do have a look at that, because it's split into several pillars. And one of those pillars is all about supporting and stimulating and moving forwards rare disease research, particularly around making better use of data. So it's kind of bringing all of these good practices together and rolling them out with some proper funding at last. Click for me, Simone. On top of all of these, in some way or another, we have the European reference networks. Now, I think most of you on the call are probably familiar with an ERN. If you're not, then again, the report that I mentioned gives you a nice summary of what an ERN is. If you click one more time for the final slide. Perfect. So ERNs, those of you who know anything at all about ERNs will know that they offer huge potential to advance rare disease research, and particularly, I think, to stimulate and improve the development of therapies for rare diseases. There are many ways in which they do this, and I would recommend that you have a look at this report on the right. You can see the links below. We had a big workshop at the EMA last May, which had a good mix of different stakeholders. And we tried to brainstorm how exactly ERNs might contribute to better clinical trials, more efficient clinical trials, more clinical trials for rare diseases. And in there, we talk a lot about the different advantages that are offered simply by the structure and the nature of the networks. So the fact that they are, in theory, permanent, they're not projects. The fact that they have this dual responsibility, they have to do cutting edge research as well as provide better opportunities to access care for patients. They are mapping where the experts are in all sorts of different rare diseases across Europe. And across the scope of these 24 networks combined, the theory is that every rare disease should be covered. So it's a great opportunity to really highlight where the experts are, where the patients are through well-defined and well-operated registries. And patients ideally should sit at the heart of this all the way through. There are various systems to ensure meaningful patient engagement in the ERNs. So lots of the pieces, I think, are in place. A big advantage of the ERNs, once they really get operating and once they begin to actually set up registries or link existing registries, will be around capturing data. If you think of 1,000 sites with experts in rare diseases all across Europe, seeing patients every day through their doors, it's a great opportunity to standardize and to harmonize. So my last slide, Simona, if you will. This was just a little bit of food for thought. As I said, what we often find in these sessions, because most of us work on the ground in specific conditions or work on particular registries, it's sometimes very hard to get an idea of what this bigger picture is. So I think it's helpful if you have the time, and if this is not so familiar to you, to do a little bit of research, and this report that I mentioned is a good starting point. It won't give you all the answers, but it will give you an overview. Once you know what's there and what's on the horizon and what are the big, what's next for us, we need to think about how actually we work with that. So how do we put the tools and the pieces of the puzzle together? What sort of data do we actually need to make more powerful and more interoperable? And for what sort of purposes? An issue I always have is that actually people talk about sharing data for its own sake. But I think being really clear about what's our value proposition, what sort of data do we want to make shareable or queryable and for what purposes is particularly important. So I'm going to pause there. I know we have a few questions. Let me have a look and I'll see if I can answer some of these. Okay. So cystic fibrosis, thank you very much, David. That was the other one I was thinking of. So the EMA started their initiative by looking at some of the rare diseases where they already had quite well-developed registries. Because actually sometimes, it's maybe controversial, it's almost easier to build a registry from scratch if a community doesn't have one, than it is to take a lot of well-established but maybe not very complementary registries and link them together. So they focused on areas which were quite well developed, so cystic fibrosis, multiple sclerosis, both of which of course are the more common rare diseases, and then more recently haemophilia as well. Let me have a look. So Joachim asked the role of Orphanet in this process. So I described a few processes there. Orphanet's very involved in these data-related activities in several ways. So Orphanet is kind of the keeper and the curator of the ontology for coding rare diseases. So if you're going to think about pooling data or using data to tell you anything, you need to know what specific condition that data relates to. Because if you just have a code for conditions, something like muscular dystrophy, that's not going to get you very far. You need to know actually that you're dealing here with a patient with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy 2A, which has a very different prognosis than other types. So Orphanet is involved in developing and improving that ontology, and they're also partners in many of these initiatives that we have on the screen. So they're sitting at the heart of this, which is very important.
Vicky, I see Hervé asking about that sometimes clinicians complain about the high administrative burden of ERNs. Mm-hmm. Now, I am not one to and I cannot answer to you in this case. Potentially that's the case, but hopefully there will be an opportunity to discuss that at the symposium. This is not exactly the focus of the symposium, but it is a concern. I don't know if you, Vicky, would like to comment about it. I think you have colleagues in Newcastle that are on one ERN, so or several. So please.
No, just to say there's been a lot of administrative burden, a lot of bureaucracy. Part of that is because I think the most obvious grant the networks have had to get set up and get running is this kind of coordination grant, and that had to be done every year. So you have the normal cycles of reporting and then writing your next grant, then reporting again. The good news is that the next coordination grant will actually run for 3 years. So I understand that the administrative responsibilities there will be a lot less, but also there are lots of avenues on the horizon for actually specifically, I think, research funding, which will be dedicated to the ERNs to help them do what they need to do. So hopefully they can focus more on the real clinical and research activities and less on the paperwork.
There was another question on GDPR and how combining different registry from different registry, how they get around the fact to ask again for, or re-asking for consent to the people that have registered in the first place, thanks to Greg. I'm not GDPR expert, but certainly what we see and also has been raised by higher level of authority, such as the Executive Director of EMA, that GDPR, particularly for health, might introduce hurdles that are difficult to overcome, in particular in the sharing of data for clinical research. I don't have a final answer to this. Vicky, is there anywhere we could find answer to the question related to GDPR and reuse of data?
I think it's only a small part of it, but I think that this concept of a way to pseudonymize patient data is quite helpful. So a lot of the emphasis these days, especially in the sort of FAIR principles landscape, isn't actually on sending data anywhere or sharing it or emailing or downloading. It's actually letting information stay where it is, so stay in its registry, stay in its hospital databases, and actually querying that instead. And this goes back to capturing the sort of metadata of what's in your resource very nicely and setting the conditions under which it can be accessed and unlocked. Of course, to do that, you need to know if that resource would contain information potentially on a patient that you're interested in. So one of the reasons I think that the research and especially the diagnostics community have moved away from what used to be called a GUID, a global unique identifier, is that actually you can't do that in a landscape like Europe. You could do it perhaps within the US, but you couldn't do it across countries. So they've come up with this concept of a PPRL, which is a privacy preserving record linkage. And that system is safe and compliant to use with GDPR. It basically entails capturing a few core items of information on a patient, giving that patient a string of nonsense. When somebody else, a different resource, a different researcher in a different country captures information on the same patient, they'll get a different string of nonsense, but a trusted third party is able to put that together and figure out that those two strings of nonsense actually relate to the same person. I'm not the best expert on this, I'm not a legal person, but I know at least on the PPRL side, that's why that solution has been sort of selected as the most favourable. And indeed, that's the solution which the European Commission, through its European Platform on Rare Disease Registration, the so-called JRC work, that's a solution that they are promoting and that they will, I hope, in time, be actually offering to people directly for their own registries.
Thank you, Vicky. I would like to thank, before moving on into the next part of the presentation, I would like to thank Vicky for this comprehensive overview. I think it is a fantastic job to condense such a huge amount of work in 20 minutes. So there will be opportunity to discuss further with Vicky and other experts on the 13th and 14th of February. But let me thank Vicky for this fantastic overview. Now, just a little housekeeping suggestion. If you are unable to see the chat or Q&A box, my technician Davo suggests that you may be able to log out and log in again in the webinar to see it. I see personally, so I see the latest question. So if you are in, thank you very much for asking question. Now, as Vicky has hinted to, we're not going to try to boil down the ocean at the Multi-Stakeholder Symposium. Just talking about all of these areas would probably entail 2 days workshop on data, or how do we use data, or what are the initiatives. So really at the symposium, we got in the two breakout session 1 and 4, we're going to focus specifically on 2 areas, particularly when we come to breakout session 1. We're going to really look at specific areas where we can see that rare disease research and development can be improved, and how to maximize the potential of already funded tools, networks, and projects and programs. To do so, we know that a concerted effort is necessary to develop a sustainable ecosystem whereby the European Reference Network might play an important role. This said, in the breakout sessions, which will be moderated by our colleague Virginie Prosfasset, and where Victoria will be the rapporteur, we will be focusing on project related to pediatric clinical trials, but also innovative ways of doing clinical trials and basket trials and other type of innovative ways to gather data. We will also look at specifically the example of the cystic fibrosis registry, where Dr. Andreas Jung will present the experience of the cystic fibrosis a registry to start off with and see how data can be collected. But also in particular, we are structuring this breakout session to really look at how innovative tools can be taken up better. What are the example of good collaboration between hospital and industry, particularly when it comes to pediatric therapies development, and so on and so forth. So we'll have a good hour and a half of discussion there, where really what we want to see is discussing about what is successful, what potential type of suggestion we have to make sure that the successful program is scaled up and are integrating into an appropriate ecosystem. Here we are looking at having a speaker from representing the European Reference Network. We are in the process of finalizing this speaker as well. By the way, that Vicky has presented the year end today. Maybe I should ask her and see how she can present on the year. I see a wry smile there. So that's where we like to do this session go. We'll have approximately about a split between an even split between presentations and a discussion with the audience. The aim, as per our breakout session, is to come back and see and into the plenary sessions after each of the breakout sessions to bring back what learnings there are and what type of suggestion can be brought forward for the next legislative cycle at the European level, of things to improve in terms of the legislative systems, or even from a funding perspective. Ideally, this will continue in terms of how do we use data in the context also, not just in the pre-approval clinical discovery research phase, but also in the post-approval phase. We very well know that many therapies that are specific for rare diseases are coming to market at time of marketing authorization with a potentially greater number of uncertainties compared to let's not say more mainstream treatments, and how can we in the current environment see the possibility to harness data in the post-approval phase to make sure that the outcomes provided by the treatments are effectively captured, how treatments are impacting the natural course of the disease, and how we can ensure that those data collected not only in clinical setting but also in a real world setting can be on one hand brought back to the system to ensure that the financial arrangement necessary to support the access of these treatments are adequately balanced, but on the other hand, also making sure that health outcomes and what really matters to patient, what really is making a difference into in the life of patients is appropriately captured and fed back into the system, particularly looping back to the topic of the breakout session 1, in order to speed up the research, understanding how disease work, and thus making treatment better, but also making sure that the research is done at increasing cost in an increasingly cost efficient way. For this reason, we will have Eileen Tracy as a moderator, our own Chris Sotiralis as a rapporteur, whereas we will have speakers from the industry talking about their work done on essentially capturing patient-reported outcomes and patient-reported outcome measures. We'll look at also how patients are setting themselves up and seeing how the example of the Hercules project and setting themselves up to collect data that are relevant to the people with rare diseases, here included the patient themselves and their caregivers, but also how do we harness those data in order to make sure that treatments are done in a cost efficient way, and finally how we are looking at collecting data in order to reduce those uncertainties, and how those data can be tied back to reimbursement schemes. We are close to completion also here for the speakers line up, just waiting for a final confirmation. Here in a nutshell, in are the 2 breakout sessions that we had. Our great hope is that we can really make a concerted effort with the people present at the symposium to really put forward recommendations and suggestions that are practicable and implementable in the near future. With this, I have concluded the presentation of the breakout session and of the symposium. I would like to thank you for your attention so far and invite you, if there is any, to ask the questions that you wish, so that either myself, if I can, and Vicky can reply. If not, we would certainly be in a position to follow up as soon as possible. In the meantime, I hope all of you, 50 plus that are there, that I'll see you at the symposium. Just remind you that the plenary session will be streamlined, so you'll also be there even if you are not there. seeming that there is a bit of good challenge, great challenge. Can I ask Vicky, if there was one thing they would like to take back from this symposium, what would it be?
One thing I would like to take back?
Yeah.
I would like, when people attend these sessions, I would like them to bring as many real-world practical examples of what's happening, what's working well in terms of gathering data, sharing data for the various activities that we mentioned along this pipeline. Put it into practical examples, because I think very often when you're talking about using data, capturing data, sharing data, and especially what different purposes you can get from registry data, it can become quite theoretical. And it's just sometimes very helpful to hear, okay, we have a registry in my disease area, and we are in discussion with the EMA and a company potentially to see, whether this would actually be suitable to collect the sort of data that the regulators need. Would it fulfill the industry's need? Could we actually use this for post-marketing surveillance? And if not, what do we need to do with it? So I think tangible examples are really helpful, and especially examples where people have really started to pool registry data. There was a question earlier about consent and how we, with the new GDPR, which sort of forbids this very broad definition of using data for research, how we actually get around that. And that's something that I would be interested in learning more about from a handful of the European reference networks who have obtained funding to do something in the registries field. So I think it's 5 of the 24 ERNs obtain some funding to either set up new registries or else to connect some existing registries in their disease area. I would like to see how they're tackling the consent issue, because this question of what you do with legacy data. Obviously, we have all these registries. We have 700 and however many registries across Europe. You don't want to scrap those and throw them away and begin again. But I think, really ascertaining what we do and what these ERNs who are starting to do this on the ground, what they're doing, will be really helpful. So make it as concrete as you can, and bring your questions and your suggestions, I think.
Thank you, Vicky. There is a question from Tony Thurburn. Well, I think the question around funding process mechanism is competitive for limited funds. I think we see this in all research areas, I'm afraid. What is one of the propositions that as EURORDIS we have made, in particularly for the post-authorization follow-up study specifically related to rare diseases, we think that there might be an opportunity to create a European fund that could support the collection of data in post-authorization phase as a research project, which would perhaps limit the risk inherent to the uncertainties from authorized product. But I'm afraid that this is probably the case in most countries, Tony. I think we can ask also what is the situation with the European joint programming, and see what there we can do to make sure that research for rare diseases is streamlined, and it doesn't have to be competitive between rare diseases necessarily. We know that money, unfortunately, is a finite resource, so we need prioritization. Vicky, would you like anything to add? Do you have anything to add? Sorry.
Again, I suppose it depends on the type of research, but certainly for some of the sort of diagnostics and trying to diagnose undiagnosed patients, some past projects that I know of in rare diseases. So the Neuromics project, which was neuromuscular and neurodegenerative diseases, and also I think the EURORDIS project, which was rare kidney diseases. So both funded under, I think it was FP6. They contributed to the setting up of the RD Connect platform I mentioned earlier, which is a way of linking omics data, so genetic diagnostic data, with deep phenotypic data. There, the researchers involved, you were expected to contribute that data under certain safeguards into this shared platform for any researcher to be able to view. Obviously not patient details, they would be pseudonymized. But they put in place things like, forgotten the term, it's not a moratorium, it's where you have a sort of a defined period of protection. So for, say, the first 6 months, that information and that data was only accessible by researchers within the project, and then you make it more open. I know some funding streams are talking about, making you actually, if you get particular funding, then you need to deposit some of your data into certain open repositories. There's talk about making your data fair. There's a question of how far you can sort of mandate that for publications to be accepted in leading journals, that you show that actually the data which you created in your project was somehow made accessible beyond the life of the project. But I mean, the details I would need to look into. But it certainly is an issue, and it's the opposite of what we're looking towards for rare diseases.
Thank you, Vicky. We have another couple of, one question and one remark. Tony, thank you again for the remark on the 100,000 genome project as an example of cutting across silo the UK. That has clearly, to my knowledge, been an example like that. There is a new initiative also launched last year in Europe, which has been signed up by about 19 countries on reaching 1 million genomes in Europe. We are not focusing on that specific initiative at the moment, but it might look like one initiative that might be cutting across silos, particularly with a significant importance for rare diseases across the European continent. This said, I understand that it still is in a definition phase, so we remain to be seen how it works. Joachim, your question is the registration problem just a financial problem? I'm not quite sure what you mean by this area.
I think Angela come in there on that question, actually. Because no, for sure, there are all sorts of...
Okay, the access of registries. Yeah, okay, so is it a financial problem? I understand now. I don't know. I don't think it is necessarily always a financial problem. Certainly, data is becoming the real currency of our world, of our time. But there might be some additional areas in which some of our colleagues, namely Julian Isla, for instance, from Dravet Syndrome Foundation, is looking at, in particular, by using blockchain or similar technologies in order to be able to access data for a limited time period. And yes, blockchain is a buzzword recently for this, but similar technique might be able to cut down costs and really create value for the data that are used. But we are remaining at a pilot project example at the moment, so we need to see how those work. Now, if there is no other burning question, with 4 minutes to spare, I would like to thank everyone that has attended. Oh, Ulrike, extraterritorial registry. What happens if a registry is located first in the US? I put my hands up here. I don't have the answer, but I guess there could be reciprocal arrangements for access. I guess if the registry would be under the umbrella either of the FDA and the EMA, there might be a possibility under a specific arrangement to be able to access those registries. But then also, I guess, is about the design of those registry. Are they collecting the same data in the same way? Are we using the same codings, and et cetera, et cetera? So but this is one area where I think participation at the state symposium might be required to ask for the right question. But yeah. Seems to me the registries are a very hot topic still, Vicky. We really, for breakout session 2, we wouldn't just specify we are presenting the registry, but we don't want to focus solely on registry. We know that there might be great opportunities thanks to integration within the European Reference Center to have pan-European wide registries, but there are many other aspects, as Vicky has presented, that needs to be tackled, need to really narrow it down. Certainly there are initiatives that are making sure that the registry are maintaining the focus that they deserve.
One area that could actually, just in the last few seconds that we have, again, one area that could be interesting to explore around the registries is the potential for synergies. And again, the ERNs are a good example. I mean, the question about the US is a very good one, Ulrike, and I think that the data protection issues there, although even if the data in the registries is compatible, how you actually link those given the current climate around data protection and the difference between Europe and the US will be really tricky. But I think around the ERNs particularly, there are real advantages in terms of scope. I think we're trying to move as a field more towards recognizing how communities can work together across specific disease areas to do things like propose a registry for the EMA's formal qualification process, to have that registry officially sort of recognized as a tool to collect data for specific purposes. The idea of coming together and not having every specific condition developing something like biomarkers or looking at outcome measures that could just be relevant for their specific condition, but looking across broader groups to say, actually, these several fields could collaborate to identify patient relevant outcome measures for this sort of a condition. So I think trying to do that economy of scale work and think about how registries can be set up and shared more broadly, it's a challenge. And I think especially for companies, so they're always told set up disease registries rather than drug registries, and that's a great message. But then how you do that in practice, who sort of spearheads that effort? And there could be some potential there around ERNs having that overarching position.
Thank you, Vicky. Yes, that's a great final comment. We are at 4. I would like to thank everyone for their patient participation. Thanks for listening to myself and Victoria, whom I would like to again thank so much for deep insight into the area. And I hope to see many, if not all of you, at the symposium on the 13th and 14th of February. Do not forget that tomorrow is February. We are starting February, so it's the Rare Disease Month, culminating on the 28th with Rare Disease Day. So make sure that you go on rarediseaseday.org to download everything that is necessary to make the day a fantastic awareness raising opportunity. Thank you once again so much for attending, and have a good rest of the day and a good weekend for those for everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you all. See you next month. Bye. Bye, Simone.
Bye, everyone.